Picture a dark, dusty room in an old asylum. An elderly woman, her hands gnarled and her eyes filled with a forgotten fire, sits alone. She hasn't touched a piece of clay or marble in 30 years. She has been erased, hidden away from the world, a ghost in her own life story. This woman isn't just a forgotten patient. This is Camille Claudel, one of the most brilliant and revolutionary sculptors of the 19th century, a genius whose work was so powerful, so raw, and so ahead of its time that the world decided it was easier to call her insane than to accept her talent. You've probably heard of Auguste Rodin, the father of modern sculpture. His masterpiece, The Kiss, is famous around the world. But what if I told you that the passion, the raw emotion, the very soul of his most celebrated works might not have been his alone? What if I told you that the woman who was his student, his muse, his collaborator, and his lover was a sculptor of such immense talent that her own work threatened to eclipse his? This is the story of Camille Claudel, a woman whose art was inseparable from her life, a life of passionate creation and devastating heartbreak. It's a story of a woman who flew too close to the sun of a famous man, only to have her wings melted and her name deliberately erased from history. And it's the story of how her family, in an act of unimaginable cruelty, locked her away from the world for the last 30 years of her life, ensuring her silence. Stay with me, because this is not just the story of a tragic artist. It's a story about what happens when a woman's genius is too bright for the world to handle. To understand Camille, you have to understand the world she was born into. It's 1864 in a small town in France. The rules for a respectable young woman are rigid. You learn to paint watercolors, play the piano, and marry well. You do not, under any circumstances, get your hands dirty with clay. You do not dream of becoming a professional sculptor. That was a man's world, a world of heavy lifting, nude models, and public ambition. It was considered no place for a woman. But from the moment she was a child, Camille Claudel didn't care about the rules. She was a force of nature. While other children played, she was out in the fields, digging up clay, her hands and clothes caked in mud, molding the faces of her family and the local villagers. Her father, Louis Prosper Claudel, was a man of modest means, a registrar of mortgages, but he saw something extraordinary in his daughter's raw talent. He was her first, and for a long time, only champion. Her mother, on the other hand, was her first and most enduring critic. Louise Athénée Claudel was a woman of strict, conventional values. She saw Camille's artistic passion not as a gift, but as a bizarre and unladylike obsession. This was the first great conflict of Camille's life: a father who believed in her genius and a mother who was repulsed by it. This tension would haunt her for the rest of her days. By the time she was a teenager, her talent was undeniable. The family hired a respected local sculptor, Alfred Boucher, to look at her work. He was stunned. He saw a power, a raw emotion, an understanding of form that was almost unheard of in someone so young. He told her father, "You have a student here who is going to go far." It was Boucher who convinced the family that Camille's talent was too great to be ignored. Against her mother's wishes, the family moved to Paris in 1881 so that Camille could study art. But even in Paris, the world was not ready for her. The prestigious École des Beaux-Arts, the official art school, did not accept female students. It was unthinkable. So Camille did what she always did. She found another way. She enrolled at the Académie Colarossi, one of the few private art schools that allowed women to study from live nude models, a practice considered scandalous but essential for any serious sculptor. She and a group of other young women artists, including Jessie Lipscomb, rented a studio together. This was her first taste of artistic freedom, her first community of like-minded women. Her early works from this period already show her incredible gift. They are not just technically proficient, they are alive with emotion. You can see her fascination with the human form, with the way a muscle tenses or a face registers a fleeting feeling. She wasn't just sculpting figures, she was sculpting feelings. And then, in 1883, everything changed. Alfred Boucher, her mentor, won the prestigious Prix de Rome and had to leave Paris. Before he left, he asked a friend to take over the instruction of his talented female students. That friend was Auguste Rodin. When Camille Claudel and Auguste Rodin met, it was a collision of universes. He was 43 years old, already a famous and controversial figure in the art world, a man of immense power and ego. She was 19, a brilliant, beautiful, and fiercely ambitious young student. The attraction was immediate and electric, personally, intellectually, and artistically. Rodin was a man who was used to being the center of his own universe. But in Camille, he recognized something he had never seen before, a talent that was equal to his own. He quickly moved her from his group class into his private studio. She was no longer just a student. She became his assistant, his collaborator, his confidant, his muse, and, inevitably, his lover. For the next 10 years, their lives and their art were completely intertwined. It was a period of explosive creativity for both of them. Camille worked on some of Rodin's most famous commissions, including The Gates of Hell and The Burghers of Calais. It's said that she carved the hands and feet of many of his figures, the most difficult and expressive parts of the human body. She wasn't just a model or an assistant, she was a creative partner. Her ideas, her style, her emotional intensity began to seep into his work. Look at Rodin's work before he met Camille, and then look at it after. You can see the change, the passion, the raw sensuality, the psychological depth. It all intensifies. Masterpieces like The Kiss, which is believed to be a portrait of their love, are filled with an emotional power that many art historians now attribute to Camille's influence. She pushed him, challenged him, and inspired him to reach new heights. But this was not a one-way street. Camille was also developing her own artistic voice, and it was a voice of astonishing power. Her sculptures from this period are breathtaking. Works like Sakuntala or The Waltz are masterpieces of movement and emotion. The Waltz is a perfect example. It shows a dancing couple, their bodies swirling together, lost in the music. It's so sensual, so intimate, that it was considered scandalous at the time. The French government, which had commissioned the piece, refused to buy it unless she covered the figures with drapery. This was the tragedy of their collaboration. While Camille was pouring her soul and her genius into Rodin's work, the world saw only him. When she created her own masterpieces, they were either seen as mere copies of his style, or they were rejected as too shocking, too emotional, too unfeminine. She was trapped in his shadow. And there was another, more personal trap. Rodin was already in a long-term relationship with another woman, Rose Buret, who had been with him since his early, impoverished days. He refused to leave Rose, even as his affair with Camille grew more and more intense. Camille, who had sacrificed everything for him, was his secret. She was the brilliant artist hidden away in his studio, the lover he would not publicly claim. For a woman as proud and independent as Camille, this was a constant source of humiliation and pain. She wanted to be his wife, his equal partner in art and in life, but Rodin would never give her that. The relationship became a torment. There were passionate reconciliations and bitter arguments. Camille grew more and more frustrated, feeling that she was losing herself, that her own artistic identity was being swallowed by his. She knew that to save herself as an artist, she had to break free. Finally, after a decade of this agonizing push and pull, she did. In 1892, Camille Claudel left Auguste Rodin. She was determined to make a name for herself, to prove that she was not just his muse, but a great artist in her own right. It was a brave and necessary decision, but it would lead her down a path of poverty, isolation, and ultimately madness.
The years immediately after Camille left Rodin were a period of incredible artistic achievement, but also of growing financial and emotional turmoil. Freed from his shadow, she produced what many considered to be her greatest works. She was no longer sculpting the passion of their love, but the agony of their separation. Her masterpiece from this period is The Age of Maturity. It's a powerful, autobiographical sculpture that tells the entire story of her heartbreak. It shows a man, clearly representing Rodin, being led away by an old woman, representing his longtime companion Rose Beret, and also representing old age and death. A younger woman, representing Camille, is on her knees, her arms outstretched, begging him to stay. It is a raw, devastating, and unflinchingly honest portrayal of abandonment and despair. It is also a work of staggering genius. When the sculpture was exhibited, the critics were stunned. They recognized its power. But Rodin, who still had immense influence in the art world, is believed to have used his power to sabotage her. A state commission for a bronze version of The Age of Maturity was suddenly and mysteriously canceled. It was a devastating blow, both financially and emotionally. Camille was convinced that Rodin was actively working to destroy her career, that he was stealing her ideas and turning the art world against her. Whether this was true or simply her growing paranoia, the effect was the same. She began to isolate herself. She moved into a studio on the Ile Saint-Louis, a small island in the heart of Paris, and became a recluse. Her financial situation grew more and more desperate. She was a woman alone, trying to survive in a man's world without the protection and influence of a powerful male mentor. Patrons who had once been eager to support her, now that she was no longer associated with Rodin, began to disappear. She continued to work, pouring all of her pain and frustration into her art. She created a series of smaller, more intimate sculptures, works of incredible psychological depth. The Gossips shows a group of women huddled together, whispering secrets. It's a sculpture about judgment, about the suffocating nature of societal opinion. The Wave shows 3 small female figures about to be engulfed by a massive wave of green onyx. It's a powerful metaphor for her own feelings of being overwhelmed by forces beyond her control. But her behavior was becoming more and more erratic. She was deeply in debt. She became convinced that Rodin had organized a conspiracy to ruin her career. She accused him of sending spies to her studio, of stealing her sculptures, of plotting to have her killed. She began to smash her own work, destroying the very art that was her reason for being. In moments of rage and despair, she would take a hammer to her plaster models, shattering months or even years of work. She was terrified that Rodin would steal them, so she destroyed them first. It's impossible to know for sure how much of this was a justifiable reaction to the sexism and professional sabotage she faced, and how much was the beginning of a serious mental illness. The line between her persecution and her paranoia had become hopelessly blurred. She was a woman who had been betrayed by her lover, rejected by the art world, and abandoned by many of her friends. She was living in poverty, starving herself to buy materials for her art, only to destroy it in fits of despair. Her family, particularly her mother and her brother Paul, watched her descent with a mixture of horror and cold detachment. Paul Claudel, who was by now a famous poet and diplomat, was a deeply conservative Catholic. He was embarrassed by his sister's scandalous life. Her affair with Rodin, her artistic ambition, her refusal to conform. He saw her break down not as a tragedy to be treated with compassion, but a shameful problem to be dealt with. Her father, who had always been her staunchest defender, died in March of 1913. He was the only thing standing between Camille and the cold judgment of her family. Just 8 days after his funeral, while Camille was alone in her studio, the authorities arrived. They had been sent by her mother and her brother. They forced their way in, and despite her protests, they dragged her away. Camille Claudel was forcibly committed to the Ville-Évrard psychiatric hospital. She was 48 years old. She would never be free again. For Camille, being locked away in an asylum was a fate worse than death. It was the ultimate silencing. She, who had lived for her art, was now in a place where she could not create. The tools of her trade, clay, marble, chisels, were gone. Her hands, which had brought life to stone, were now empty. She wrote desperate, heartbreaking letters to her brother Paul, to her friends, to anyone who would listen, begging to be released. She insisted she was not insane. "I am not mad," she wrote in one letter. "I have all my reason, all my intelligence. I have paid for all my faults. I have suffered enough. Let me live the little time I have left in peace." In her letters, she describes the asylum as a prison, a tomb. She complains about the cold, the bad food, the mindless chatter of the other patients. She is surrounded by people who are truly and deeply ill, and she feels completely out of place. "It's not right that I should be deprived of my freedom," she wrote. "I have not done anything to deserve this punishment." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. Her mother, cold and unforgiving to the end, refused to even visit her. In 30 years of confinement, her mother never once came to see her. She also refused to allow Camille to receive mail from anyone but her brother or to have any visitors. She was systematically cutting her off from the world, ensuring that she would be forgotten. Her brother Paul did visit her, but only a handful of times over 3 decades. His visits were often a source of more pain than comfort. He saw her confinement as a form of spiritual purification, a necessary penance for her sinful life. He wrote in his diary about her pride and her rebellion, framing her artistic genius as a character flaw that had led to her downfall. He could not or would not see her as a victim of a system that had no place for a woman of her talent and ambition. But what about the doctors? Did they believe she was truly insane? The records are heartbreakingly clear. After just a few years of observation, the doctors at the asylum wrote to her mother, suggesting that Camille was not, in fact, mad. They stated that she could be released into the care of her family. They recommended that she be allowed to live a quiet life, perhaps in the countryside. Her mother's response was swift and brutal. She refused. She wrote back insisting Camille remained locked up. She was terrified of the shame and scandal that her daughter might bring upon the family. For her, it was better to have a daughter who was a forgotten madwoman than one who was a free and unconventional artist. And so Camille remained a prisoner. Year after year, decade after decade, she languished in the asylum. The fire of her genius, which had once burned so brightly, was slowly extinguished. She stopped asking for clay. She stopped talking about her art. She simply existed, a ghost haunting the halls of the asylum, her mind filled with the ghosts of the sculptures that she had been forced to abandon. She once wrote a letter describing her life in the asylum. "What a novel my life has been, and how it is that I am here after all that has happened. To fall so low, it's hard. To have no more share in life, to be the voluntary victim of a brother's ambition." In 1943, during the Nazi occupation of France, conditions in the asylums became horrific. There was little food, no heat. Patients died of malnutrition and neglect by the thousands. On October 17, 1943, Camille Claudel died in the Montferg Asylum. She was 78 years old. She had been locked away for 30 years. Her brother Paul, the famous Catholic diplomat, did not attend her funeral. None of her family did. She was buried in a communal grave, her body laid at rest among the other forgotten souls of the asylum. There was no headstone to mark her passing. Camille Claudel, the sculptor who had dreamed of fame and immortality, had been completely and utterly erased. For years after her death, Camille Claudel remained a footnote in the story of Auguste Rodin. She was the student, the muse, the tragic lover. Her own work, what little had survived her own destructive rages and her family's neglect, was scattered and forgotten. The art world, which had once been so captivated and scandalized by her, moved on. But a great artist can never be truly erased. The process of her rediscovery began slowly, thanks in large part to the efforts of a new generation of art historians and curators, many of them women, who began to look at the story of modern art with fresh eyes. They started asking questions. Who was this woman who appeared so often in Rodin's story? What happened to her work? In 1984, a major retrospective of her work was organized in Paris. For the first time, the public could see the breadth and power of her art separate from Rodin's. They saw the passion of the waltz, the heartbreak of the age of maturity, the psychological depth of the gossips. They saw a body of work that was not just a reflection of Rodin, but a powerful and original artistic statement in its own right. People were stunned. Here was a major artist, a sculptor of incredible power, who had been almost completely written out of art history. The exhibition was a sensation. It sparked a new wave of interest in her life and work. Biographies were written, films were made. Scholars began the painstaking process of piecing together her story, of finding her scattered sculptures, of reading her heartbreaking letters from the asylum. What emerged was a portrait of a woman who was not just a victim, but a fighter. A woman who, for a time, went head-to-head with the most famous artist in the world and held her own. A woman who paid the ultimate price for her refusal to conform to the expectations of her time. Today, Camille Claudel's place in art history is secure. In 2017, the Musée Camille Claudel opened in Nogent-sur-Seine, the town where she spent her childhood. It is the first museum in the world dedicated to her work. It stands as a powerful testament to her genius, a permanent correction to the historical record that tried to erase her. Her sculptures, what few remain, are now considered priceless treasures. They are celebrated for their emotional honesty, their technical brilliance, and their profound psychological insight. Art historians now see her not as a student of Rodin, but as a co-inventor of modern sculpture. They recognize that the emotional revolution in sculpture at the turn of the 20th century was not the work of one man, but the result of a passionate and tumultuous dialogue between two artists of equal genius. But her legacy is more than just her art. Her story has become a powerful feminist symbol. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of a world that is afraid of female genius. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How many Camille Claudels have there been throughout history? How many women of incredible talent have been dismissed, forgotten, or called mad simply because their ambition and their power made men uncomfortable? When we look at her life, we see a story that is still heartbreakingly relevant. We see the struggle of a female artist trying to be judged on her own terms. We see the way a woman's personal life is used to discredit her professional achievements. We see the devastating impact of mental illness and the cruelty of a society that chooses confinement over compassion. And we see the ultimate tragedy of her relationship with Rodin. He took her youth, her passion, her ideas, and built his own fame upon them. And when she demanded to be seen as his equal, he and the world he represented cast her aside. Rodin went on to have a museum dedicated to his work in the heart of Paris. Camille died in a potter's field, her grave unmarked. But in the end, Camille Claudel could not be erased. Her art was too powerful. Her story was too compelling. The fire of her genius, which her family and her society tried so desperately to extinguish, has been rekindled. The woman who was hidden away in an asylum for 30 years is now celebrated around the world. The sculptures she thought were lost have been found. The voice that was silenced is now heard.
When you stand before one of her sculptures today, you are not just looking at a piece of bronze or marble. You are looking at a life. You are looking at the passion, the joy, the heartbreak, and the rage of a woman who dared to create in a world that did not want her to. You are looking at the soul of Camille Claudel, and it is unforgettable.
If this story made you angry, if it inspired you, if it made you wonder who else has been erased, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now.
Because if we don't tell these stories, who will? And if we don't remember these women, who else gets forgotten tomorrow?
They can steal credit, they can rewrite papers, they can dominate textbooks, but they can't stop us from finding the truth and sharing it.
That's why you need to subscribe to Women Erased. Let's rewrite history together.